Could I ask you all please to stand? Because I would like us to have a minute's silence for Danielle Beckham, and for the other young lives that have been tragically cut short in this country as a result of guns and drugs. And I think it's important that we do whatever we can, however little it is, to eliminate the conditions that give rise to the violence. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I am glad that I've been given the opportunity to talk to you a bit about the work that I'm doing at the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health. I am the national organizer for the Breaking the Circles of Fear implementation team at the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health. Quite a mouthful. Before I carry on, can everybody hear me? In the back, can you hear me in the back?
Yes,
No, I don't think so. Is this switched on? No. Can everybody hear me now? Okay. Right. Okay. Well, today I'm going to talk a bit about the Breaking the Circles of Fear project, and also bring you up to date with the recent developments. Now, I am part of a small team based at the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health. Now, I don't know how many people have heard about the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health, but we are a mental health charity. We're based in London Bridge, but we work nationally. And when I say we, I'm talking about the Breaking the Circles of Fear implementation team. And we're a small team based within this much larger organization. The team comprises Dr. Joanna Bennett, who I believe you've met before. Some of you would have met before. She spoke at the last conference. And she's the workforce development and training lead. There is Frank Keating, who is the senior research fellow. The joint program leads are Errol Francis and Yvonne Christie. There is a service user consultant called Paul Gray. I don't know if any of you have come across Paul Gray, but he's done a lot of work and is someone of a very high standing, actually. And Sandra Griffiths, who is a voluntary sector coordinator. Both Sandra and Paul work on a consultancy basis. And lastly, there's Polly Tyler, who's our administrator. The team was established in 2003, and it was set up following the publication of the Breaking the Circles of Fear report. This was a report which actually looked at the relationship between African and Caribbean communities and mental health services. Now, the Gatsby Foundation, which is the funders, the trustees of the Sainsbury Centre, agreed to fund the work that we were doing and provided the funds for our team. But before I talk about the team, I'd actually like to talk about the report, because I know that maybe quite a few of you may not have actually heard about the report. The Breaking the Circles of Fear report was based on a 2-year study, which, as I said before, it looked at the relationship between African and Caribbean communities and mental health services. It actually is the largest study of its kind in the UK. It features interviews with service users, families and carers, and a range of mental health professionals, including the police. Now, defeated by technology. Okay. We carried out 34 focus groups, and involving almost 200 people. And people shared quite moving and often quite tragic stories about their relationships, their experiences of mental health services. And this quote is actually a quote from a carer. It says, "But now I realize, after the past 3-4 years, I begin to understand the culture and the fear. That is a circle of fear, because there's fears in the victims, and there's certainly fear from the mounted police. It appears that the police were as afraid of my brother as he was afraid of them." And what he was actually relating was the way in which social services and the police actually responded to his brother being in crisis, which was to turn up with 3 vans, police in riot gear, to take his brother into hospital. Sadly, that is not a unique experience. But what he actually drew from that experience is that the police were actually functioning. It was about fear. It was basically about fear. And in fact, one of the key findings of our report was that service users feared contact with mental health services. And the fear was to such an extent that they feared that contact with services would eventually lead to their death. Such was the strength of fear. And sadly, as is highlighted in the cases of David Rocky Bennett and many others, this has turned out to be well-founded. Fear, black people, and mental illness, a vicious circle. Our study was premised on a belief that there are circles of fear which lead to poor treatment of people from black communities. And the findings suggest that there are fears that impact negatively on the relationship between black communities and mental health services. The need for changes to the mental health care and the treatment of people from black communities has been widely recognized and is long overdue. There are innumerable reports. There is a strategy that's now ongoing. Have you heard about the Inside-Outside report? And that was a government study, actually, that was initially led by Professor Sashi Duran, which actually highlighted the inequality in terms of services for people from ethnic minority communities. Now, our study is focused specifically on people from African and Caribbean communities, and we did this because not only is this group the most overrepresented in terms of psychiatric services, but it is also the group to which the greatest level of fear seems to be directed within our society as a whole, as well as within mental health services. Sadly, black communities associate mental illness with being detained in hospital and involuntary treatment in a confined and restricted environment. And black service users remain the most disaffected, the most dissatisfied of all people using services. And such is the level of disenchantment with services, among service users, families and carers, that people actually believe that mental health services no longer have their best interests at heart. And I think fear is quite interesting, because fear is inextricably linked with both racism and mental illness. It is a component of race relations and racism. And black people are normally cast as outside, alien, and therefore viewed with suspicion, hostility, and anger. And this basic fear of the outsider, the other, the alien, affects not only relationships within society, but it also reflects relationships within mental health services, between professionals and black citizens. And that was our starting point. Now, as I said, in terms of the context of the review, all the evidence now, for the past 40 years actually, we've had research evidence which showed the overrepresentation of black people in services. As I said, there have been numerous inquiries, and sadly numerous deaths. And also, there now is the, sorry, you can't, sorry about that, you should talk. There now is the Race Relations Amendment Act actually, which ensures that we eliminate racist practice from all institutions. Oops, sorry. Okay. As I said, I'm not going to quote research because we don't actually need research to tell us what we already knew. I mean, we took all this as a given. In terms of the, I mean, black people are 7 times more likely to be admitted to the hospital under the Mental Health Act. The higher rates of readmission, once in hospital, physical treatments, medication, black people are most likely to be an over-diagnosis of schizophrenia and under diagnosis of depression and affective disorder. There is a study that's carried out, the only community study. What's interesting that these studies are of people in treatment, people in hospital. There's a community study that was carried out by James Nazaru, which actually looked at the community, and what he found in the community was that there was a greater incidence amongst people in black communities of depression rather than schizophrenia. But somehow, when people get to hospital, the diagnosis is about schizophrenia. I think that is actually tied up and linked to the fact that black people don't actually get depressed. They're quite happy generally. And I think there are quite historical reasons for that. As I said, we all know about the problems with medication. I think the Bennett case actually highlighted that. Not only was David Rocky Bennett on something like 2 or 3 different types of antipsychotic medication, but the dosages actually exceeded the recommended, the BNF recommended levels, and his consultant actually couldn't account for this. What she said, however, it had nothing to do with the fact that he was black. I'm sure it didn't. We all know about the police and the sections 1 through 6, 1 through 7, which is what is actually used when the police take someone from the streets, or when the police bring someone into hospital. So like I said, what we wanted to do, we took all that evidence as given. We were not interested in replicating all these studies, because we've had 40 years of studies and no change. So what we did was that we decided that we would focus on what is it that's actually stopping change. And we would explore these circles of fear. That's it. Right. And I think what was quite crucial was that we would actually involve service users, families and carers in not only getting their experiences, but finding out what they thought we should be doing. It's about solutions, but actually solutions that are acceptable to people in their communities. I think all too often how people carry out research is that you have people who are experts, who actually devise plans for other people. Right? So that's the them and us. And I think that it's essential that we actually have a say in plans, in decisions that directly affect and impact on us. Anyway. Oops. Yeah. So also we wanted to identify policy and practice, because we know that there are black service user organizations that actually are doing quite good work. Problem is that they're not properly supported, and mainstream services don't actually use the knowledge and experience that these people have. And we also thought it important to explore issues around race and culture, because there's a real misunderstanding about culture. And also, you know, we want to provide, as I say, an analysis of what's happening currently, and most importantly, have a plan to bring about change. And this plan, part of this plan was the setting up of the Breaking the Circles of Fear team. As I said, so we had this call for evidence. We interviewed over 200 people. We carried out interviews with, as I said, a whole range of mental health professionals. We also had site visits to black voluntary sector organizations and to some statutory services. And the idea behind it is that we wanted to look at places where people were doing innovative and kind of interesting and good, exciting work with people from African and Caribbean communities. And we had an implementation and dissemination plan that said that we would go out and we would tell people what we found and what we intended to do about it. Okay. I mean, what we found, so we found that there are actually these circles of fear which stop black people from engaging in services. Acute services, mainstream services, are actually experienced as being inhumane, unhelpful, and inappropriate. It wasn't what people wanted. The only thing that services seem to provide is medication and or control and restraint. Nothing else. And when we talk about the care pathways, normally what happens is that if you, for the rest of the population, people normally go to see their GP. GPs they're normally referred to psychiatric services. But what we find is that this actually doesn't happen. That people end up in hospital in crisis. And what it actually does it affects the ways in which people are treated. Okay. So primary care is lacking, and so too is community-based crisis care. And acute care, particularly hospitalization, is actually was actually seen as the worst possible thing that could happen. And people resisted as long as they could before having to go into hospital. And also, there is a real difference in terms of the ways in which people in the community view and talk about mental illness, and the way in which professionals talk about it. So, professionals talked about kind of disease and pathology, whereas people had a much different way in terms of the way in which they actually viewed it, and not only the ways in which they viewed mental health problems, but also the ways in which they should be treated. And I think that actually gave rise to a fair amount of conflict. I mean, most professionals tended to view mental mental illness as a kind of chemical imbalance, brain disorder, what have you. And if people continue taking the pills, they would get better. But people within the community, actually what they were finding out was that actually it's a lot more than that. And it's not simply about medication, but it's a host of other things. And sadly, instead of viewing family and carers as taking an active part in the treatment process, families and carers were viewed with a certain level of hostility, and in fact were seen to be part of the problem instead of part of the solution. And this was highlighted when we had a focus group in Lambeth, and there was a woman who related a story about her son, and she had tried to get her son to see the consultant because she thought he was breaking down, he was unwell. And the consultant wasn't taking any notice of her. She kept on phoning him. And eventually, she said to her that, he said to her that, you really need to allow your son to grow up. You're mothering him too much. And that really, he hasn't got a problem, it's you who's actually got a problem. This woman actually came in from work one morning and a neighbor knocked on the door and said, have you seen the television news? Because there's a woman was killed, and there's a report on it. And there was a report about a woman who had been killed, and she saw the guy who did it, and it was his son. And he's now on Broadman. And it was just a very kind of tragic story. So I've already spoken about the team. Okay. If I can talk about our priorities. Okay. So second in the back, user movement. Paul Gray, who is our service user consultant, is actually working on a program called I&I, which stands for I'm trying to remember what I&I stands for now. It's Inspire and hold on, I'll tell you in a minute. Yeah, inspire and influence. That's it. Yeah. And the idea behind that is that it's based on a model of social enterprise. So it's actually getting people back to work. And Paul's view, and Paul is someone who has been using, or who stopped using mental health services, or who was involved in the mental health system some 10 years. But he's managed to turn all of that around, turn his life around, and actually has set up his own business. And one of the key things is about employment and self-worth and people realizing their dreams. And this is what he's actually trying to do. He's currently seeking funding, external funding, so that this group can continue independent of the breaking the surface affair. We had a seminar, a national seminar in Birmingham a couple of weeks ago, when we brought together service users with the objective of actually setting up this network. Actually, I've got a lot more to say than time would allow. I had originally intended to talk just about the stuff that we were doing, but then I realized that people actually hadn't been aware of the actual report. So I took some time to talk about that. So I'm going to have to kind of come to a rather abrupt end.
One thing to note, would you want to hear about some work that Paul, David, sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Quickly. Okay. Right. Okay. To date, we've run 2 seminars on evaluations for the black voluntary sector, because this is, I think, something that's quite key. There's a lot of good work that's actually going on within the black voluntary sector, but I think one of the problems is that the good work that the black voluntary sector actually does isn't properly quantified. And so we started this process of helping the black voluntary sector in actually putting, I think, the good work that they do in what I would say is putting it in such a way that funders and the statutory sector organisations can actually understand and appreciate. And this is vitally important, because we know that many of the black voluntary sector organisations actually work very well with black service users, and they actually appreciate it. But it's how we go about actually quantifying what it is that they do, and that is a real difficulty, and that is something that we're actually working on. Actually, one of the organisations that we work with is currently in the process of developing an evaluation strategy for their service. As a consequence of this work, we are actually looking at developing either a workbook or a series of training programs that voluntary sector organisations can come and they can actually learn how to carry out evaluation. And that is being led by Frank Keating, who is our senior research fellow. We've now established a whole series of regional implementation groups there are about 12 regional implementation groups that are established around the country. In Cardiff, in West Midlands, Manchester, there are about 4 in London.
Trust.
Yeah, hello. I'm afraid I've brought acetates, but it's not working because I'm from the Dark Ages, so I'll just have to talk. The summary of what I'm going to say. I think that somebody from the executive team from the Community Trust was meant to come and talk at your last meeting, and it didn't happen, and I'm very sorry about that. I just want to talk a bit about myself and my career, my experience of working with people from an Afro-Caribbean background. And really it's to kind of anecdotally confirm what David has just been saying. And after I've done that, I'm going to move on to the specifics of the David Bennett story. This is my first job out of the inner city. I've worked in Newham, I've worked in Hackney, Tower Hamlets, Wandsworth, Lambeth, and my speciality is managing challenging behaviour units and working with people who've got treatment-resistive psychosis. And I can confirm that particularly in Hackney, where there's about 25% of the population are from an Afro-Caribbean background, and Lambeth, where it's slightly higher, there is massive overrepresentation of people of an Afro-Caribbean background, particularly black British people, on the acute wards. You get up into the intensive care wards, it's up to 60%, about 40% on the acute wards, and the higher the levels of security go, the more disproportionate the ratio of people of a black British background is. And you end up on the medium secure unit, and there are almost no white people there. And it's shocking. And I guess I've been part of the problem over the last 15 years, because I've been nursing on these units. And I've moved to Luton now. I've been in Luton for a year. To me it's like a leafy suburb. It may not be like a leafy suburb to you, but it is to me, and I'm very glad to be here. And it is the case that black people are over-medicated. It is the case that black people don't get access to psychological therapies in the same way that white people do. And it is the case that there are circles of fear. It's a very aptly named report. Black people are frightened of the mental health services because we're associated with the criminal justice system. We're associated with a coercive, a politically oppressive regime. We're associated with a racist society. And mental health services stereotype black people and are frightened of black people in turn. And it's this dreadful spiral of fear. And the people who end up getting damaged most are the black mentally ill people. And of course, black mentally ill people don't want to engage with us, and I can understand why. The other part of this equation is the staffing. Frankly, British people do not want to do psychiatric nursing, and I'm not just referring to white British people, it's black British people, it's Asian British people. People are not coming forward to our colleges to do nursing. They don't want to do it. That's the frank reality. And so we're recruiting from overseas. We're getting people from the Philippines, from Mauritius, some people from Zimbabwe, a few people from South Africa, and a lot of people from West Africa, a lot of people particularly from Nigeria and Ghana. And so you've got this situation on these high security wards, intensive care wards. You've got the white people managing at the top. You've got people from a West African background doing the nursing, and then a lot of black British people who are the victims of this system, who are the patients. That's the truth, and I want to acknowledge that truth. It's painful to talk about these things, but I think it's best to talk about them, because, as I'm going to allude to later on, it's best to name things, because if you don't name things, and it's too embarrassing to talk about, then they just lie there festering. Okay. David Bennett. David Bennett was born in 1960. He was born in Jamaica. He was one of 8 siblings. His parents came over in 1968 to the UK, and his dad was worked for the London Brick Company, and they moved to Peterborough. And David started his working life as a sign writer. He was a talented musician. He was a good footballer. I think he was almost going to play for Peterborough or some such team. So he was somebody who was up for life. He was also a Rastafarian, and he started a Rastafarian club in Peterborough. His first contact with psychiatric services was in 1980, and the psychiatrist who saw him diagnosed him as having a drug-induced psychosis. The psychiatrist refused to give him the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and he attributed David's problems to misuse of recreational drugs. And that persisted for 5 years, and he committed some petty crimes. He ended up in prison, and he ended up getting bullied badly in prison, and he was ill in prison, and he wasn't properly cared for, he wasn't treated, and then he came out of prison, and he did get the diagnosis of schizophrenia in 1985, but it didn't really help with his treatment. He ended up going on to an acute ward in Peterborough, I think, and he went into intensive care from the acute ward, then to medium security, which is a higher level of security than intensive care, back to the acute wards, back to the community, and there is no care in the community quite often, more often than not, for people who've got severe mental illness. And then he's back onto the acute wards and back into medium security. And it's a familiar story, and it represents a failure of our mental health services. And it isn't just about David, it's about hundreds, thousands of people. He went to St Andrews, which is a private medium secure unit, but he actually ended up in a place called the Norfolk Clinic in Norfolk Mental Health Trust. And his last and final admission to the Norfolk Clinic was in 1995. Now he died, as we all know, in 1998 during a restraint, and I'm going to go into the details of that restraint in a minute. The Norfolk Clinic serves Norfolk, and 2% of the population of Norfolk are from an ethnic and black background. 10% of the patients in the clinic are from a black and ethnic background. Again, massive disproportionate representation of black people within medium security. There was no attempt to attract staff from the black community. David wrote to the chief executive of the Norfolk Trust asking him to make an effort to recruit black staff, and he got no reply because it wasn't recognised as a problem by the executive team. Now, David had an ongoing reluctance to take medication. The medication that we provide, frankly, is toxic. The newer medication that we're providing, the so-called atypicals, is less toxic, but there are still very serious side effects that people get from this medication. It's serious stuff, and there are good reasons why people don't want to take it. And I think that frequently, as mental health professionals, we don't want to listen to that. We don't want to listen to people who don't want to take medication. We just want them to take it, so everyone's safe. But David didn't want to take it. There were acts of violence, sporadic acts of violence towards staff, and staff were frightened of him. But nonetheless, staff said he was a charismatic man. He was charming, and people liked him, or so they said. As David has alluded to, there was no real attempt in David Bennett's case to engage with the family. David was engaged with his family. He went to see one sister once a month, but the family's views were not solicited. People didn't ask the family what they thought about the care that David was being provided with, and they felt they weren't listened to, frankly. There was no clear indication that his cultural or social needs were met or even considered in a systematic way. His key worker was, I think, a Zimbabwean, and his key worker denied the fact that his cultural needs were not attended to and said, I brought him the voice, I gave him some Bob Marley tapes, but it was a bit patronising and dismissive, frankly. And David was on very high doses of medication. Okay, I'm going to go to the night of his death now. There was a white man on the phone. He was talking on the phone for a long time. David wanted to use the phone, and he ended up assaulting the white man. Later on, the white man cornered David, beat him up, and hurled a volley of racist abuse at him. The staff separated the two. The racist abuse was not addressed in any way at all. There was no indication that the white person was reprimanded or boundary was laid down about his behaviour. David was the one who was moved to the higher security ward, not the white man. And no explanation was given to David when that happened. He subsequently hit a nurse hard, and the nurse was badly injured. And then people piled on top of him. He was held in a prone position for, I think, over 30 minutes, and he died. He died as a consequence, probably not of the medical overdosing of him, but because of the way in which he was restrained. His lungs simply gave out. And I might add, it could have been. I could have been one of those nurses. You know, it's not about the individual nurses. It's about the system. And anyone who works in psychiatry in the inner city could have been one of those nurses. I just want to read a quote. Sorry, how long have I got there?
Yeah, well, sure.
All right. I just want to read a quote from the Macpherson report into David Lawrence's killing and the subsequent police failure to investigate that killing. Institutional racism is a collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. And the key phrases in that are unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping. The Race Relations Amendment Act requires public authorities, such as mental health trusts, to eliminate unlawful discrimination, to promote equality of opportunity, to promote good race relations between persons of different racial groups. Now, you can't promote equality of opportunity if you don't acknowledge that there isn't equality of opportunity, and you can't promote good race relations between people if you don't acknowledge that there aren't good race relations, and there aren't. We have to acknowledge it and name it. I just want to go back to the report. The report found that there was no deliberate racism on the part of the staff. But I just want to pick out a few phrases. The consultant who I think who was mainly in charge of David's care while he was in the Norvic clinic said that David didn't like authority of any description, that he wanted to be treated as equal, as if that's an extraordinary thing to expect. His Rastafarianism was not acknowledged. And there's this frequent refrain from the white staff in the Norvic clinic that there was no need to discuss the issue of race because we're all nice people here. We're not racist, we're nice. And David wasn't bothered about the race issue. He wasn't concerned about being a Rastafarian because we're all nice people. And I think this is a very good phrase from the report. The people who wrote the report found that David Bennett was subject to repeated acts of racist abuse. And there's this good phrase, the corrosive and cumulative effect of racist abuse upon a black patient. Again, just to re-emphasise what David just said, that they found more generally black people have a very real fear of mental health services, that staff regard black patients as more aggressive, more alarming and more dangerous and more difficult to treat, and that institutional racism is present throughout the National Health Service. Now, I I don't think the problem is about the cultural competence of our staff. I think the problem is about power. And I think racism causes mental ill health, and I think the services as they're presently constituted exacerbate a problem that may exist already. The Trust is responding to the David Bennett report. We're probably not responding as vigorously as we ought, and we need you to tell us that, and you can tell me that in the question and answer session. To our shame, we haven't been having cultural competence training over the last couple of years. We had good cultural competence training, it stopped. People lost interest at the top of the organisation. It's starting again, I'm glad to say. We are also introducing a mentoring scheme for staff, because as I've alluded to before, one of the big problems we've got in mental health services and in the NHS in general is this glass ceiling for black staff. It's white people who get up into the top of the organisation, and in our executive team we've only got one person of a black and ethnic minority background. I've seen in your programme that that Claire Wallace has come to speak to you today from the Early Intervention Services. I think this is the single most important thing we're doing. People have a bad experience of the mental health services if they engage with it late when they're ill. They get iller if they don't engage when the illness starts. And this is the experience of black people. They're frightened of us, they don't come and help us, they're very ill by the time we get there. And their first experience of the mental health services is bad. So it's really important that the early intervention services help people when they need to be helped at the early stage of their illness. And it's important that we're open to the Afro-Caribbean community, and we've got links with the Afro-Caribbean community so that people can get referred to the early intervention service. I'm sure she told you it's an open referral system. You don't have to go through a doctor. You can just refer people. People can self-refer. So please engage with that service, and I really believe it will make a difference over the next 5 to 10 years in the career of people who have severe mental illness who are also black. Good. Okay.
Information for referrals.
Sorry, just the last thing I want to allude to in the recommendations. It also talks about early advocacy. So it's not just about services coming early to black people. It's about advocacy, working with black people at the early stages of their illness, when there's the best chance of them recovering and the best chance of them being socially included. So I hope Dignity are fully involved with the early intervention service. If you're not, it'd be really good if you were. Sorry, I cut you short.
It's okay.
Yeah.
We are. I'm Claire.
You are. You're Claire. Yeah. Sorry. That's all I've got to say. I'm going to stop now, but I'll be in the plenary session, and I'll answer your questions, and you can have a go at me if you want to. Yeah.
Again, we'll have opportunity to ask us those burning questions that you're just dying to ask afterwards. At this time, I'd just like to invite Nyabingi Group, Nyabingi.
All right. I don't remember exactly when the last Dignity conference was. It was approximately 6 months ago, thank you. And then I made an announcement that we, as a team, hadn't practiced and performed together much. Little has changed since then. But don't be disillusioned, the quality and the standard is still high. So ladies and gentlemen, please take in the Nyabingi drummers.
One, two, three, four. You can't go to Zion with a common mind. No, you can't go to Zion. in the righteous way. I have been walk in the righteous way. The righteous way is to watch and pray. I have been no harm. Oh God of mine, Holy Mount Zion, Holy Mount Zion is a holy place. No sins cannot enter there. Holy Mount Zion is a holy place. No sin cannot enter there. So let the word of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O for us. 1, 2, 1, 2. Yeah. The next song is basically saying, you know, how Jesus' power can heal people. You know, not just medication, not just therapy or counseling, but also, you know, the strength of the mind, Almighty Creator, you know. So the song goes like this. Yo. Jesus is my provider. Jesus is my provider. Jesus is my provider. I know He'll deliver me. Jesus is my provider. Jesus is my provider. Jesus is my provider. I know He'll deliver me. Pain in my head, He delivered. Everybody, yo. Pain in my head, He delivered. Pain in my head, He delivered. I know He'll deliver me. Pain in my eye, pain in my eye, He delivered. Pain in my eye, He delivered. Pain in my eye, He delivered. I know He'll deliver me. Pain in my back, pain in my back, He delivered. Pain in my back, He delivered. Pain in my back, He delivered. I know He'll deliver me. Pain in my foot, pain in my foot, He delivered. Everybody, yo. Pain in my foot, He delivered. Pain in my foot, He delivered. I know He'll deliver me. Pain in my hand, pain in my hand, He delivered. Pain in my hand, He delivered. Pain in my hand, He delivered. I know He'll deliver me. Jesus, Jesus is my provider.